So just where is globalization going? It's day one of $16 billion worth of fresh tariffs on U.S. imported Chinese goods, and in response, duties on the same amount of merchandise going the other way. Donald Trump doesn't expect much from a second day of trade talks in Washington. He's threatened to escalate, while his Commerce Secretary warns, quote, "We have many more bullets than they do." While free marketeers shudder at Trump's quip about trade wars being winnable and point to the self-inflicted pain of stymieing trade in an interconnected world, many of those who voted, for instance, for Brexit feel Brussels didn't do enough to stand up for them when the Chinese were dumping steel and other goods. It's not just industry that's worried. In an era where capitalism is driven by digital and where the hot commodity is information and personal data, advocates of open borders squirm at China's ever-tightening censorship laws. Do U.S.-based tech giants play along with Beijing's rules, and doesn't that turn their business models on their heads? Which brings us back to Trump and the question, can tariffs force China to open up its own economy? If not, well, what next? Today in the France 24 debate, we're wondering if it's the end of free trade as we know it. Joining us from Washington, former Deputy Director at the U.S. Commerce Department, Chris Garcia is CEO of Vicker Financial. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Also in the U.S. Capitol, Josh Kalmer, Executive Vice President of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council, which lobbies on behalf of tech groups. Welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
And welcome back from Amsterdam, Kingston University professor Steve Keen, the author of Debunking Economics. How are you? Very well. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Let's start with the latest. Beijing suing the United States at the World Trade Organization. This as those mid-level talks wrap up in Washington. Yuka Royer has more.
Punishing each other in the middle of trade talks. A new set of tit-for-tat tariffs on $16 billion worth of goods came into effect just as US and Chinese officials resumed their discussions. Following an earlier round in July, a total of $50 billion worth of products are now subject to new import duties. This shopkeeper in Beijing, though, isn't worried about the escalating trade war.
The US provoked us in the first place, so let them pay the price. I believe that our government is doing the right thing by imposing retaliatory tariffs.
Beijing also announced it would file a fresh complaint at the World Trade Organization over US tariffs. The move came as US business leaders and industry groups are voicing their opinions at a 6-day public hearing on another set of tariffs announced by the Trump administration on $200 billion worth of goods not yet covered by the earlier measures.
I think it's a rash decision by our heads, and we're just caught up in an economic warfare, and we're just taking turns trying to shoot at each other.
The duties of up to 25% on a wide range of consumer goods could take effect next month. China has vowed to hit back with levies on $60 billion worth of US products if they do. The tit-for-tat tariffs are hurting businesses on both sides. China's retaliatory levy on US soybeans, for example, have hit American farmers but also their Chinese clients who face higher costs. A higher import duty on Chinese-made computer parts could hurt American manufacturers whose own products are made in China. As the list of targeted products widens, there's increasing concern that the bilateral trade spat will disrupt the global supply chain.
Let me begin with you, Chris Garcia, your former boss, Wilbur Ross. Do you stand by what he says when he says we have many more bullets than they do?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we do. We have more chips to play with. Frankly, one of the things that we have to our advantage with such a strong economy as the Chinese economy is on the decline and in running a trade deficit is that there are more goods for us to slap tariffs on. There's more damage that we can do to their economy than they can do to us. It's important that we return to a system, and I think the overall theme of this renegotiation is we have to return to a system where nations' leaders are sticking up and advocating for their people and putting the interests and the will of their people first. It's going to be very difficult to see a communist regime like China actually truly open up its markets and reciprocate with what we've provided them here in the United States. So again, the ultimate goal is zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers, zero subsidies, true free and reciprocal trade.
But again, it's an interconnected world. Some people are saying it's just a non-understanding how the world works when Donald Trump talks about trade wars being winnable.
Well, I think they don't understand how the world works. I think what have the past administrations done to correct the bad behavior of China? They've done nothing. They've thrown their hands up and they've said, well, I guess things are just going to be made in China. I guess that these jobs that have built America, the American worker in the heartland of our country, are just going to be sold out while their jobs go overseas, while these factories get shipped overseas, and we're going to just let China do that. I think that, frankly, President Trump's strategy is much more wise because he understands the ability that the United States has and the upper hand that we have to inflict pain on a trading partner that is lying, that is cheating, that is outright not playing on a fair playing field.
Josh Kalmer, do you agree?
Chris makes a couple of important points. I mean, there is no doubt that China has abused the privilege of being a WTO member essentially since it joined in 2001. And it is also true that this administration has taken a very bold step in seeking to redefine that relationship and in producing several months ago as good of a report as there exists, laying out the range of things China does to advantage its own companies, to make life difficult for companies from the United States and other markets, and to impose an unlevel playing field. That said, the response of tariffs is not the right one. It's precisely the wrong thing to do to address the systemic structural problems in China's economy. And that's because tariffs are taxes, and they're taxes that the United States is imposing on itself, whether it's on people, individuals buying things at stores where consumer products have higher prices, whether it's reduced job opportunities for Americans who work at companies that rely on affordable Chinese imports. It is a shot in the foot, essentially, as an effort to respond to a very legitimate problem.
So what is the right way to pressure Beijing?
Well, it would be nice if the right way were as quick and easy as the wrong way, tariffs. The fact is, China's got an incredibly complex economy with deep structural problems that will require the concerted effort, not just of the United States, but of the European Union, of Japan, of the group of countries, of trading partners that adhere to WTO rules to work together to address. And so what we have advocated, in particular in this context where the investigation is about a system of laws and policies that focus primarily on intellectual property and technology transfer, is a negotiation that focuses precisely on that. A concerted, ideally internationalized negotiation where the Chinese, it's not just talk, the Chinese are held to verifiable benchmarks with meaningful threats of international action behind it to force change. But it won't happen overnight. Tariff is sort of like a sugar high. It feels good, but the harm falls on precisely the wrong people. It falls on precisely the people that the administration appropriately is trying to help.
And before I turn to Steve Keen, Chris Garcia, quick rebuttal.
Sure. No. This is exactly why we have to have something that shocks the system. Otherwise, it's going to take years and years to have any type of WTO sanctioned resolution to some of these problems. Once China has stolen IP from an American company, once China has already inflicted the damage to some of these American companies and the damage has been done, how do we recoup those losses? In many cases you can't. So the president is rightfully taking some of the steps necessary. Sure, there was going to be a little bit of a short-term hiccup perhaps, but frankly, 2/3 of Americans have the confidence in the president to use these tactics as a negotiating tactic, simply as a means to an end. But frankly, we have to do something different. That's why the American people elected Donald Trump, because he was going to do things differently.
Steve Keen, your thoughts on this?
Well, the interesting starting point is that the conventional argument is that free trade benefits everybody. And when you take a good look at the empirical data and you take a look at the arguments behind free trade as well, that argument's wrong. Countries that practice mercantilism like China has been practicing actually do succeed compared to those that go for free trade. And they can get away with it so long as they're a small part of international trade. But of course, what's happened with China now, China's exports are over $2.3 trillion per year, almost $1 trillion higher than America's exports. So when you have the largest country in global trade advantaging itself at the same time by practicing mercantilist policies, obviously something has to be done to break that behaviour. And I agree with the other speakers here that Trump may not be doing the best thing, but he is upsetting the apple cart, and that has to happen to bring these practices under control.
What is the best thing in your view?
Well, the best thing is to realise, first of all, that what matters so much is not actually trade but investment. And what China's been successfully doing is harnessing an enormous export surplus and borrowing American technology, and sometimes, as one of the speakers said, stealing American technology quite deliberately to build up an industrial base. And they've been incredibly successful at it. You might say there are structural problems in the Chinese economy, but at the same time, compared to what it was like in 1981-82, they've come a hell of a long way. Now, what you have to then say in this case is the people who've suffered out of this have actually been the workers of the American heartland. They're the ones who've gone backwards. They're the ones who voted for Trump. They've been deindustrialized. So I think what's necessary really is for America to start investing in its own homeland again in a way that it frankly ignored for the last 30 years as American corporations took advantage of cheap Chinese wages to increase the profits, pretty much at the expense of a redistribution of wealth and income from their own workers to themselves.
Josh Calmer, do you read it the same way?
I think Steve makes a couple of important points, as did Chris. One is that while trade in goods with China and around the world remains important, the importance of investment, the importance of services, the importance of intellectual property continues to rise. And so there is no question that the harms that arise out of China stealing or digesting U.S. or other countries' intellectual property is incredibly important. Once it happens, the damage is done, and it deserves a strong response. Part of that response goes to Steve's second point, which is the importance of the United States investing in itself, whether it's STEM education, whether it's physical infrastructure, whether it is digital infrastructure, broadband deployment, and so forth. There are a lot of good policy choices that the United States needs to take, both vis-a-vis its own economy, but also vis-a-vis China. We all seem to agree on the diagnosis. We have very different views of the medicine. As we've put it, people are asking the right question, but right now they have the wrong answer. There's no question, though, the administration has got China's attention. It still has the opportunity to use it in an effective and bold way, but in a way that won't actually harm Americans in the short term or the long term.
Chris Garcia?
I mean, frankly, again, we have to go back to where this started. You know, when China was let into the WTO in 2001, what did we expect? We let a wolf into the sheep's pen, and you know, when we have an actor whose motives are certainly not in the best interests of Americans, they're looking to play in an unlevel and an uneven playing field. That's exactly what they did. They outright have just completely stolen from the United States. They've lied, they've cheated. I mean, what are we supposed to do? What have past administrations done? Again, they've done nothing. We have to restore the level playing field, and frankly, we have to make sure that, and this is why President Trump respects many of these, some of these strong leaders of their nations, because they drive a tough bargain.
But Chris,
that's what leaders are supposed to do.
But Chris, do you take the point of the other two guests in our show that Trump is only addressing here part of the problem, part of the reason why those who voted for him have not seen their lot improve over past years? The other part being that there hasn't been enough investment domestically in things like education.
Oh, 100%. I think it's by 2025, we're going to need to have 50% of all U.S. jobs with some type of a STEM understanding. Right now, we have a labor shortage in the STEM fields. Frankly, one of the things that the president would like to do if he stopped getting beat up by the media unnecessarily for it is provide school choice, provide an ability for parents who, are perhaps like myself, who grew up in a very impoverished community where we don't have to be restricted to the zip code that we're born in or that we live in. We can go and choose the school we want to send our children to. We can try to open up competition and make sure that education is serving our children the way.
So the answer is more
teachers.
privatization of schools, is what you're saying.
I think it's school choice. I think whether that's private or a public-private hybrid, it has to be school choice. You have to have the ability for consumers, parents that is, to choose what they want for their children. And parents want the best for their children, so we should give them the opportunity to choose. But how that fits into the overall strategy is, we have to make sure that, yes, we're taking care of things domestically, we're investing domestically in the necessary improvements in education, as we just talked about, but we also have to make sure that other nations are playing fairly. And right now is the time to do it. We have a strong economy. We've got the longest market expansion in history. We have, frankly, many of the economic indicators show that we are in such a position of strength relative to China's weak economy that this is the perfect time to do it. This is the perfect time to renegotiate. So, again, the American people are resilient. We've lived through the Great Depression. We've lived through the Great Recession. We'll take a couple on the chin if that means landing a couple of haymakers against China to make sure that they play fairly.
Steve Keen, the United States does not just have China in its crosshairs. It's got the European Union and Germany. In the case of the EU and Germany, they are playing by the rules more than China when it comes to those WTO standards. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it all goes back to the stupid decision America made in the Bretton Woods Agreement with Harry Dexter White pushing for it, that rather than having a genuine international currency created that didn't belong to any particular nation, which Keynes called the Bancor, rather than using that for international trade, the American delegation insisted on using the American dollar. Now, really, many of the problems we're talking about now flow from that mistake, because what it meant was there's a demand for American dollars over and above the need to buy American goods, which drives the American dollar higher, benefits the financial sector, but undermines its industrial sector. And this is a large part of where the international global imbalances have come from. Of course, in Europe's case, another currency has caused the problem there. It's the euro, which has enabled Germany to run enormous trade surpluses of the order of 10% of GDP, and forces huge deficits on the rest of the world and also on some of the remaining members of the European Union. So getting our currencies wrong in the first place is a major part of why we're in this problem right now. And the smartest thing that Trump could do, of course it goes entirely against his grain, would be to declare support for the Bancor and remove the American dollar as the basis for international trade.
All right, I'm not sure if you'd agree to that. When we come back, we're going to take a look more specifically into how the economies are interconnected using that example of tech. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and it's day one of just the latest escalation in the tit-for-tat sanctions between the United States and China. China, which is suing the U.S. before the World Trade Organization over this ratcheting up. With us, he formerly was of the U.S. Commerce Department. Chris Garcia of Vicker Financial is with us from Washington, as is Josh Kalmer, Executive Vice President of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council, which lobbies on behalf of tech. And in Amsterdam, Steve Keen, who teaches at Kingston University, the author of Debunking Economics. We're wondering where globalization is going, where protectionism is going, where free trade is going. Let's talk about high tech. The supply chain for those products often takes the goods, really around the globe before they reach consumers. So when China launched its Made in China 2025 program to push for technological self-sufficiency, that raised eyebrows among those accusing Beijing of intellectual property theft. Brian Quinn looks at the robot industry in the context of the current trade war.
They may not be Terminators, but robots are on the front lines of a war, the trade war between the United States and China. At the recent World Robot Conference in Beijing, escalating import duties were a common concern, and as new tariffs on $16 billion worth of exported goods come into effect between the two countries, the Chinese robotics industry is clearly in Washington's crosshairs.
The trade war will have an impact on the production of robot. It will reduce the production of robot because exporters will worried about future export orders growth, so they will not easily expand their factories.
China's industrial robot production shot up by 68% last year, lifted by the government's Made in China 2025 program, as Beijing looks to boost domestic brands in sectors dominated by foreign technology. But those numbers are now falling. Annualized growth rates for robot production fell from over 35% in May to just over 6% in July, just as the trade war began to heat up. Made in China 2025 is one of the key targets of the Trump administration, which accuses China of intellectual property theft and unfair technology transfer policies. Industrial robots were among the first Chinese products hit with tariffs. Beijing says it recognizes the need to strengthen intellectual property protections and open its industries to foreign investment. But with Chinese investment in U.S. tech companies soon to face greater scrutiny and Trump threatening even more tariffs on Chinese exports, the robot wars may be just getting started.
Josh Kalmer, your reaction to that report?
Well, there is certainly a lot of discussion about Made in China 2025 and the extent to which it is designed primarily to target U.S. competitiveness and give the Chinese a leg up. I mean, I think nobody can want to deprive any country, whether it's China or Vietnam or Poland or the United States, of the desire to become more developed, to enable a better life for its citizens. But it has to play by the rules, and that's the key point here. As China seeks to move up the value chain, as it's often referred to, it is important for the United States and for other trading partners to ensure that it does so consistent with the rules that everybody has agreed to. And that is precisely the outcome we would like to see out of this 301 investigation. It's precisely the outcome that we have sought in other contexts, for example, where national security is at stake. And so our view is that if the United States invests in itself through the measures that I and others have talked about on this show, and if it ensures working with partners around the world that China and other countries play by the rules, that is the kind of level playing field that is appropriate.
And correct me if I'm wrong, your organization is more worried about this, even more worried about the cyber censorship laws in China than Made in China 2025.
Well, I would focus on other things. So I would focus on issues at a higher level of generality. We're focused on trade, which has to do with making sure that China competes fairly when it comes to trading goods, when it comes to trading services, when it comes to protecting intellectual property. We are concerned about cybersecurity, ensuring that companies, not just our companies, the 67 companies that we represent, but their customers, which include companies in every single sector of the economy, have safe and reliable data and networks, and that the operating environment in China is one that respects that. Our companies also care a lot about consumer privacy, and that is a topic of increasing interest in China. It's very understandable that people will identify something like Made in China 2025 and sort of use that as the banner or the slogan for something to be addressed. But you have to look beyond that. You have to look at the details. You have to look at the actual regulatory environment.
Yeah, because we've seen companies like Apple, which has started to store from its iCloud encrypted storage service, started to store the data in China, the Chinese data from that. Do you think that's wise?
This is a great example. I mean, fair question. fundamentally, the security of data, the privacy protections of data are a function of how it is stored, how it is managed, the kinds of human and organizational processes that companies and governments follow to ensure the integrity of that data. And so location ends up being fairly unimportant. So if the Chinese, in this case, are respecting international privacy norms, if they're respecting international cybersecurity norms, if they're allowing companies to compete on a level playing field consistent with international rules, there is no reason why companies shouldn't be able to do business in China in ways that flow from what's best for their consumers and the ability of companies to innovate.
Because as it is, Apple seems to be preparing for the day when they're going to have to hand over all the data to Chinese censors for a look.
Well, that is one of the things, regardless of the company, that our organization focuses a lot on. In fact, it is one of our top priorities in the trade negotiations, both trade negotiations that the United States is undertaking and, in fact, in this discussion with the Chinese that we hope will gain momentum, is that turning over data as a condition for doing business should not be allowed. Companies should never be put in the position of having to do that. So you've put your finger on a very important point that needs to be addressed.
Steve Keen, your thoughts on this?
Well, I want to just talk about the level playing field idea, actually, which has come up a few times here. We tend to forget that we obviously forget that America and the Western world haven't exactly played fair with China in the past. China's come out of over a century now of recovering from the impact of the Opium Wars on China. Now, people often would imagine Opium Wars were trying to prevent China exporting opium to the rest of the world. The exact reverse. The Chinese needed nothing really from the West, and in that case, the English started exporting opium to China. And when China started to stop the importation of opium, which was destroying their culture, the Chinese fought back and were defeated by predominantly the British, but including the Americans, to force them to be continued to allow to export opium to China. Now, that destroyed what was one of the greatest civilizations on the planet. They've started rebuilding it in the last 30 or 40 years. And don't believe that the Chinese aren't thinking about that and saying we need to get to the stage where we restore our old powers, and we also are no longer dependent upon the West, which we cannot trust. So I think America could do with learning a few lessons of its own long-distant history before it starts criticising the Chinese about not obeying a level playing field and not playing by the rules.
All right, but how does a company like Apple do business in China?
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, I do agree about the point about censorship and access to data. The Chinese come from a very different political background. People joke about the extent to which Z is inserted into everything, but it really has got a very feudal flavour to it rather than a Western democratic flavour. And I would be very worried about data sources being stored in China rather than stored elsewhere, because the Chinese authorities will on occasion simply break into them. And that is not something which you would have happen as overtly anyway in America.
Chris Garcia, is it already you could try to have trade wars, you could try to pressure, but when you see just, how many countries are involved in the making of the phone that's in your pocket right now, it's impossible to try to pressure the rest of the world.
I don't know. I mean, I just paid $1,000 for an iPhone X, and I thought that was an absurd price. If we ask consumers to pay $1,300, $1,400 for an iPhone X, the next one, do you think they'd bat an eye? I think initially they might, but I think ultimately, with such a robust economy, thanks to President Trump's domestic policies, I think people have more money to spend, and they're willing to, if they're conscious about how they're spending their dollars, and they know that China's ripping off U.S. companies, and maybe we have more friendly allies around the world that can manufacture these devices, I think we'll take our chances. We don't have to be beholden to Chinese manufacturing. We just don't. Frankly, today where we have some of these Silicon Valley giants that are compromising their own values and their own integrity, security. We just had Google, employees up in arms about Google Lite, if you will, or some type of a Google, censored Google that was going to be made available in China, and now the company's looking to walk that back. You have Oracle and Apple and certainly Amazon who are looking to store their data in China because China's forcing them to, and they're just acquiescing to that demand. I think it's time for American companies to follow President Trump's leadership and to stand up for themselves, to stand up for what we believe in as Americans.
Silicon Valley doesn't need China?
I don't think they do. I think if we can get China to start to come back to the table, and frankly, this is what we do. This is what you do in business. You look for multiple sources. You look for multiple, supply chain solutions. And so I think if we can try to find and identify allies that will play by the rules, that will play ball, and that can team with us in our alliance against China's bad actions, I think that will put enough hurt on their economy that they'll come back to the table. Couple that with the tariff actions that President Trump and his trade advisors are taking. We need to be more aggressive about this. We can no longer sell out the American worker and sell out American businesses that are playing by the rules.
Josh Kalmer, you agree?
No, I mean, I on a lot of levels, I don't. I mean, I spend a lot of time in China meeting with Chinese government officials, as do my colleagues. There is not a sense that this is going to move them substantially. Obviously, they would like an end to the conflict, but they are moving up the value chain. Trading goods continues to be important, but they are investing in themselves and they're investing around the world. And so I don't think we should underestimate their capacity to roll with it. I mean, I think when you talk also about the impact on Americans, it's not the move from $1,000 to $1,300 for an iPhone X. It's the person in Akron who is going to spend a lot more for an air conditioner or a refrigerator or a computer, for that matter, where the circuit board assembly inside has just been marked up 25%. It's the soybean farmer in Iowa who's just found a critical global market, not cut off, but a lot more expensive because the Chinese have retaliated. You can replicate those kinds of anecdotes over and over and over again. And the fact is, global engagement by U.S. headquartered companies serves Americans. It creates jobs in the United States. There is no inconsistency between companies investing around the world and that investment lifting up Americans, creating opportunities, increasing exports. And China is a critical piece of that picture. You can't have a truly global company. You can't truly recognize and realize those benefits when you cut out 1/4 of the world's population. And so with respect to most aspects of that answer, I disagree.
All right, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but there's so much more to say. And of course, it's not over yet. It's only just beginning, if you believe the Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross. Josh Kalmer, I want to thank you for joining us from Washington. I also want to thank Chris Garcia and Steve Keen with us from Amsterdam. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.